Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second in a range of dedicated webinars for our Wild Dog Capital partners and potential partners. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Our format today is going to be quite quick and punchy, but I think that the topic that we'll be covering is more and more relevant almost on a daily basis. As South Africans and South African investors and the South African investment community, we've been confronted by years of issues relating to state capture, a macroeconomic backdrop that hasn't necessarily been that suitable for domestic investment, specifically in the equity space, and ultimately through that and I guess a negative attitude towards the direction and trajectory of our country and our economy, coupled with what we've experienced this year, beginning of this year being the COVID and energy crises. I think we've never seen such a large amount of interest and demand for not necessarily just the externalization of capital from a South African investment perspective, but also setting up the right infrastructure and structures to not only protect those assets against taxes, both being inheritance tax or death duties, but also in terms of creating an asset base that's sustainable through generations. Inside of our group, we are lucky enough to have Haiden, who will be chatting to you today. Joined our group through a transaction. Peter Armitage and myself, the very first business that we ever met with, that we had a real interest in joining us because of the quality of people in the business and also the immediate cultural alignment, was a business called Robert Cowan Investments. Robert Cowan Investments was started in 1982, which, as it turns out, was the year that I was born. Haiden, who eventually led the business, joined the business in 1989. And why that's of particular relevance, not just because of the amount of the depth of experience inside of the business, but more so because of the fact that it's one of the few businesses in South Africa in the investment management space where the owner and operator had dealt with 4 generations of wealth. So great-grandparents being passed on to grandparents, being passed on to parents, being passed on to children, which for a lot of people, the kind of terms set up a trust and set up your structures for intergenerational wealth rolls off the tongue quite easily. But Di and her team have actually experienced it and experienced the passing of that wealth through the generations, over the years that they've been running that business. We did a transaction some years back and brought them into our fold, and ultimately, had the desire or appetite to get their skills from kind of an intergenerational wealth perspective and the ability to help families navigate the changes that have happened in South Africa, navigate the changes that have happened in the world. And so we are very excited to have brought them even closer to us recently in the ambition of setting up a global family office type offering. Di's going to chat through offshore trusts, which we think are of particular relevance at the moment because of the large amount of interest and appetite that we've experienced in them, certainly over the course of the COVID crisis. So that's about enough from me. As I think that you guys can see if you've been on video conferences with me before, I've moved venues from downstairs to up. So with a bit of luck, my children don't run in and disturb us. And again, thank you very much for joining us. At the end of Di's presentation, obviously we'll cover some questions and answers. But if you have any questions, you can also pop them on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Thanks, guys.
Go to the top. Right. Morning, everybody. I think Matthew should introduce us at all the presentations that we do. Thank you, Matt. That was lovely. So I'm going to launch straight in. We've got half an hour and it is very high level. And I hope that it'll be of great interest to all of you. And as you can see, the subject is we're on offshore trusts, and that is primarily what we're going to focus on. What qualifies us, I think Matt has already been through, to even tackle a topic like this, which is very complex and complicated, and always to point out straight up front, it is always very case specific and depends on the client's individual circumstances. So to give you the high level and just point out that it's 30 years of experience and actually working on the ground with offshore trusts. They were there when I arrived at RCI, and we now manage far more money in trusts than we ever have before. So what are we going to talk about? Here we go. Those are the contents. I'm going to run through this very quickly. What is a trust? Why do you need an offshore trust? Where? Setting up the trust, what's involved? What are the investment structures that lie underneath the trust? The tax considerations, which will have a big focus on it in this presentation, and how you get money in and out of trusts, and then the conclusion, which will be where you ask whatever questions you would like to. So what is a trust? And there you've got it right at the trust, at the top. A trust is a fiduciary relationship in which one party, known as a settler or donor or funder, they're also called, gives another party complete control and transfer of all assets to the trustee, and gives the trustee the right to hold title to property or assets for the benefit of the third party, the beneficiary. The beneficiary is usually the settler and the settler's family. So, why do you need an offshore trust? And these are the reasons, just straight up front. If you're looking at offshore trust, the quantum of assets can be anything, but to make it cost effective based on the costs that there are, we're looking at a figure of plus minus $2 million. But that, as I say, is again very case specific. So we need an offshore trust for legal protection for the settler's assets. We need it for the distribution of capital and income according to the wishes of the settler, so that other beneficiaries can benefit. And that is probably, those last two are the most important. It's a generational transfer of wealth, and I'm going to show you in the next slide how that works, and the tax effect of offshore trusts, bearing in mind that most jurisdictions where offshore trusts are registered, there is no tax. So that is something that we will concentrate on, as I've said, going forward. Right, so why? Why would you want this transfer of generational wealth? Why is it so important? So we put together a little slide here to show if you have assets in your own name, what the effect is, and if you have assets in a trust, what the effect is over 2 generations. So you'll see along the bottom there are a whole lot of numbers, and those are periods of 30 years where we've got that line in the middle. So in your own name, which is the blue and the sort of creamy color, what happens is that you accumulate your wealth, and you then, when the line turns blue, you retire, so you accumulate at a lower rate, and then you die. Sounds very sort of trite, but that's basically what happens during your working life. And on death, you're going to pay estate duty. The other option is to put the money into the trust, or your wealth into the trust, accumulate it over the years, retire where the red line ends, orange line starts, and at the time that you die, the assets in the trust, because of the costs, more than anything else, and we are comparing apples with apples in our particular example here, you're just slightly ahead of where the assets had been if they'd been in your own name. But it's the second generation and subsequent generations that benefit. So in your own name, the next generation, so you've now transferred the wealth into their name, so to your family, they then accumulate more wealth, they retire, and when they die, the estate duty is even higher. This is all based on South African estate duty, by the way. And then you've got the trust. And this is the effect of not having to pay the estate duty on the death of the second generation. And you can see that the assets in your own name have grown 11 times, and in the trust, they've grown 23 times. And that is purely the effect of tax, basically, and the estate duty that applies on death. So for that reason alone, it's a good reason to transfer your wealth or to start having your wealth in a trust, and preferably offshore at this stage. Right, what legislation governs these trusts? You want your trust in a jurisdiction offshore. Those ones that I've mentioned there are the three most common jurisdictions that are used by South Africans. And basically they are set across the world in venues where the tax rate is very little or nil. And that's how these particular jurisdictions have sprung up. And for South Africans, we basically use either the Channel Islands, which is that black dot near the UK, or Mauritius, which is the black dot in the middle of the ocean next to Madagascar. You can see there's another dot on the other side, which is the BVI Cayman Islands, and very often those are also used. BVI is one we come across more and more. So you want your trust set up in a jurisdiction where the laws are friendly for what you're trying to do, and where the legislation actually that is within those jurisdictions is well versed in trust law. So what do you need to have when you set up a trust? I've got down there administration, because the administration of anything now, with all the compliance we have to jump through, including FATCA, common reporting standards, the admin is hectic, and you need to know what you're doing. First thing that has to happen with a trust, you've now decided you want an offshore trust, you've got to set up the trust deed. And what does the trust deed do? It tells you what the rules are that are going to apply for governing your trust. And I mean, they're all pretty standard and they're general, but there are, you've got to name beneficiaries, etc. So, oops, sorry, everybody. Moving on. So you then have the settler, who very often is the funder of the trust. So that is the person who settles the trust. In a number of these jurisdictions, you get what's called a declaration of trust, where they don't name a settler, but for tax purposes, there is usually a settler. You can then decide who your settler is. If you are the person who has made the wealth you want to transfer into the trust, or are going to, you don't necessarily have to be the settler. There are advantages to you not being the settler, and you can use other family members, but that's something we would go into. As I said, it's case specific. The one thing you do really have to have in an offshore trust, which is different to local trusts, is a corporate trustee. Now, a corporate trustee in those jurisdictions I showed you, there are a number of trust companies who specifically accept trusteeships in offshore trusts, and companies are set up around that. The corporate trustee you need, because you do not want to compromise the place of effective management of your trust that you are setting up offshore for the reasons that you want it offshore. And depending on how it's set up, you can compromise a place of effective management if you have too many connections with the place where you are tax resident. So that is very important that you have that component within your trust. I'm just going to, Kate, you must keep track of time for me. Okay, because I'm not very good at that. So then you've also got to choose who the beneficiaries are. So you as a settler, or your client as a settler, has a family, and it's usually the family that are the beneficiaries, but doesn't have to be. In the past, there were charitable trusts were very much part of setting up trusts. They were beneficiaries. It's not really done anymore. We can go into the reasons for that, but it's not relevant now. And the one thing that one doesn't have in a South African trust, if you're familiar with local trusts, very often, but you do have often offshore as a protector, bearing in mind that you've got corporate trustees that you do not know on the whole. You might have a relationship, but it's professional, it's not family. You may find that you don't like your corporate trustees, or they do something that you don't think is what you want done. A protector is there to basically, they have different powers, but one of the powers they can have is a power to ask the corporate trustee to step down if you want to appoint another trustee. If you don't have that, the corporate trustee does not have to resign if you want them to. On the whole, I haven't seen that happen, but the protector just gives you some kind of protection. It also, you can give the protector powers to amend the beneficiaries in conjunction with the trustees. What you just have to be a bit careful of is, again, where your protector is, what the powers they have, because, again, you don't want to compromise the place of effective management of the trust. So moving on. Within the trust, which you've now set up, and you now want to transfer assets in, what are the structures you can use within the trust? Do you need a structure? Don't you need a structure? And again, it's very case specific. It depends on your particular circumstances and what your intention is. So the assets within the trust can be held in the trust's name. They can be held in a company owned by a trust, and they can be held in some kind of wrapper if you feel that's important. And a lot of the time, these structures depend on what you want to be invested in or what your investment manager wants to invest you in, and the tax considerations. So I'm now going to move on to the tax considerations, and we consider this one of the focuses that one concentrates on when you're setting up an offshore trust. You have to understand the client's particular circumstances, because you have to take into account, if you look at that slide, I know it's very busy, but you have to take into account where the client is resident, where their beneficiaries are resident. Are they SA tax resident? Are they not? Are they in the UK? Are they in the US? You need to look at transferring assets into the trust. Is there going to be capital gains tax? When you want to move the assets into the trust, does Section 7C of the income tax apply? Do you have to look at attribution? It's very complicated, and the number of the acts that one has to take into account. We are not attorneys. We don't quote sections of the Income Tax Act, but we know the rules that apply. And I think it's important to point out here that we know enough to know when we don't know enough. And if we don't know enough, we will always seek legal advice. You will see shortly what the consequence of some of that advice has been and what we're doing now. You've also got to be aware of how all the people or the persons involved in this trust are connected. Are they connected persons? Aren't they? So that very busy slide, when we are introduced to a client, all of this is going through our heads in order to decide what needs to happen with the structures that you need to set up. And it's at this point that we would look and say, well, do you or don't you, is an offshore trust applicable or not? And we would then move on to the next slide, looking at the tax considerations. So if you look on the right-hand side, there's that block that says trust. That's an offshore trust. In the jurisdiction where the trust is registered, there is no tax. So all the other jurisdictions globally are always looking at ways in which they can tax not the trust itself, but either the people putting money in or the people benefiting from the trust. And so what we have to do is work out with the particular circumstances how we put this whole picture together so that we're getting the best effect of having an offshore trust and not subjecting the offshore trust to unforeseen consequences, because there can be. And that basically is our job to a large extent when we're looking at a person's asset base and whether offshore trusts are applicable or aren't applicable, and taking that mishmash from the slide before and making sure it applies to what we're doing and coming up with what we hope is a solution. And we always try to go for the simpler solution, not the most complicated, but that's not always possible. So you will see in the middle of that slide, there's a little block, 2 blocks that say loan donation. So moving on to the next slide, how do you get the assets into the trust? So you've now decided to set up this trust, and you've got assets that are sitting in South Africa or are actually sitting offshore, and you need to either transfer them by foreign investment allowance or they're offshore already, and how are you going to get it into the trust? First thing you can do is you can do a donation. So you give the assets to the trust. And again, it depends on your particular jurisdiction, but I'm talking your tax residency, but I'm talking really specifically about South Africans here. Or you can do a loan. There are other ways, but I'm not going in. This is very high level. So I'm sticking to what we're doing here. We've heard of other structures that you can use, but at this point, for this particular purpose, this is all we need to know. So the loan you put in, that's you lend the money, the settler lends the money, or it doesn't have to be the settler, other folk can put funds into trust. They can also lend it. But there are tax effects for all of this. So if you do a donation as a South African resident, the donation is going to be subject to 20% tax. And in addition to that, that's not the end. There is the potential for income earned in the trust to be attributed back to the donor. So that's quite complicated, but I just wanted to point out here that you do the donation, you haven't necessarily finished paying the tax. On a loan, there are also tax effects, but here again, it depends on how the loan is set up, which is what I'm going to go into next. But you could be paying a deemed donation in terms of Section 7C of the Income Tax Act, attribution where you have to attribute any capital gains, interest, foreign dividends, whatever is earned in the trust back to the settler or the lender. Transfer pricing can apply. You've got to understand who all the connected parties are, and there could potentially be income tax as well. So obviously, whatever you do, you've got to be aware of your client's circumstances and which is going to be the better tax benefit. So we've decided that donations are probably not the way to go, but as I said, it's case specific, and we're going to go for a loan. So if we're going to do a loan, we have two options. The money is then transferred by ex-con allowance, or as I said, from offshore, and it can go in as an interest-free loan. The loan agreement is drawn up like that. It can go in as an interest-bearing loan. If you have an interest-free loan, again, there are tax implications, and there they are. Section 7C, which was introduced a couple of years, a section of the Income Tax Act, assumes that the receiver assumes that there's deemed interest, and you're going to pay a deemed donations tax on that at 20%. The interest rate depends on a number of things, but if it's a South African loan, it's a repo rate +1. Capital gains tax can apply, and income tax can still apply. There's a complicated formula that applies or that is used, and we won't go into detail here. And on the other side, if you have an interest-bearing loan, there is income tax still to pay. So why would I choose either one of those, and which is going to be my better option? Again, it's very case specific. So what you've got to look at is the amount of the loan. You've got to look at the base currency of the loan. You don't have to have the loan if you're a South African resident in rands. It can be in any other base currency that you choose. You've got to look at the interest rate that applies to the interest-bearing loan. And then there's a tax effect. And we're going to go into that in a bit of detail now, so you can see the difference between whether you've got an interest-free, interest-bearing, and whether, depending on which sections of the income tax apply, as to which is the better one for you. And again, this is just an example. It's not one size fits all. So we've got a trust, and now we're looking at the tax on the loans of the money we put into the trust. We've chosen a base currency because it doesn't have to be rands. Your loan agreement can be drawn up in any base currency. We've chosen Swiss francs, and the reason is going to become obvious shortly. If you're looking at the slide, you can probably see it already. And we just said that the loan to the trust is 3 million. There are dividends that are earned in the 1 year of 30,000, and there's a capital gain of 35,000. We've assumed that the individual's marginal tax rate is 45% because, as you know, capital gains is based on whatever the marginal rate is of the individual involved. And then what we've done is we've taken the loan and we've said it, if it's interest-free, what tax is going to be applicable in overall, and again, this is very high level, to that particular year where you've had the loan in place. So you've got Section 7C, which applies. Because the interest rate is 0.5%, it's not the South African repo rate plus 1. Your interest there is only 3,000 because you're looking at, for Section 7C, it's whatever the rate is in Swiss francs plus 1%. The rate in Swiss francs is actually minus 0.5%. So your interest rate is 0.5%. You're going to then, because you've got the loan, you being the South African tax resident, you are going to pay tax on dividends and you're going to pay tax on capital gains at your top marginal rate. So the interest-free loan in 1 year is going to be subject to tax of 15,721. If you have an interest-bearing loan in Swiss francs, again, it's your rate is going to be the 0.5%, the minus 0.5% plus the 1%. And you then calculate what the interest is on 3 million, and it's 15,000. So the tax you're going to pay is tax on that interest, and it's going to be 6,750. So you can immediately see how important it is to know what you're doing on what kind of loan is set up. And again, it's always very case specific. And very often it's a choice that the settler or the lender makes. So how do you get assets out of a trust? We now got them in and they've grown amazingly well, and your wealth manager has done a good job, and somebody wants funds out of the trust, not necessarily the settler, it could be a beneficiary. How do you transfer the funds out? It's either by distribution or it's by repayment of the loan that's been set up. What is the tax effect? Distributions we've put across there. To start with, there probably is no tax effect. You're allowed to bring, and I'm talking South African now, South African residency. You're allowed to bring original capital back without having to pay any tax, but after that tax applies. Or you repay the loan. Repayment of the loan has no tax consequences. You're allowed to bring it back here and not subject to tax. So what are the costs involved? And this is where everybody usually gets stuck on, on one too far. Gets stuck on trust. They think that the costs are punitive. There are extra costs. It depends how the trust's set up. It depends what's happening within the trust. The reason why it becomes expensive is because these trustees, anything over a basic fee that they charge, they do charge hourly rates, and these jurisdictions have very expensive hourly rates. We've worked out ways that you can run trusts so that the trustees are not too involved, and that gets your rate down. So those are the fees that you're going to have to pay. There's a trustee fee that's paid for their fiduciary responsibility, admin fees, which is often where your hourly rates come in. You need a set of financials. Please don't have trustees that don't do financials. Even if you have to pay for them, it's worth it. If you have a company underneath the trust, there are obviously fees for that as well. Excluding the company, we found that running these trusts, the fees are anything from $5,000 to $10,000 per annum. So that's why the quantum of assets going in here is quite important before it becomes cost effective. So what we've learned over all the years is, number one, how we can get the costs down to some extent. But I think what's more important is you've got to be well aware of the client's overall assets there and how all of their estate fits together. Because you've got to consider what the assets are, where they are, what their family circumstances are. Do they need a local will? Do they need an offshore will? Do they need an offshore trust? Do they not need an offshore trust? If they have a local will and an offshore trust already, which is often the case, so there are already trustees in place all over the place, as it were, those two, the trusts and the wills, have to talk to each other. We very often see conflicts between wills and trusts, and they're not in sync. And that can cause huge issues later on. And what we then do is we look at all of those aspects, and we then look at how we can restructure the client's asset base to be cost and tax effective. There are all sorts of things we have to take into account, as I've shown you before. And I'm moving on now to the next slide to show you what we actually do. So we analyze the existing structures. And in that, it's not just the investments, it's all their immovable property, it's anything anywhere in the world. One has to take into account, we're coming across a lot of people who've got Portuguese property, but they don't have the right structures for it, they don't have the wills, and that's going to be an issue when they die. We then advise the client on what we think the correct structures are. It may not be an offshore trust. This was specifically designed to show you why offshore trusts we think are beneficial, this particular presentation. But it might not apply. There might be other things that apply. And we would then go into that. We would select the offshore trustees based on where the client wants the trust set up. We do have relationships in Mauritius and the Channel Islands in particular. And very often that's a choice that the client would like to make. At the moment, we think Mauritius is a good venue. It's close. And we do have contacts there or we have relationships we can use. And then we obviously, as Anchor, manage the investments. And even if the client decides they want their assets to be diversified and not have all their eggs in one basket, we don't see that as a problem, but we do insist on knowing on an annual basis what the assets are, so that we know we're not causing double jeopardy and either investing too concentrated in one particular area or leaving a gap in another. And we also find often that there's structures in place that may or may not be appropriate with whoever is managing the other assets. And then obviously we look at the tax effect. So if we're recommending that structures be changed and assets be moved around, we work out what the capital gains tax impact is going to be, whether that does or doesn't apply. And we work out how to get the assets in with the correct tax benefits applying. So the client is always aware of what the tax implications of what we are doing are. So that brings me to the end. How much more time have I got? 4 minutes. Oh, that's not bad. Okay, so we're moving on to this last slide, which is tips, interesting facts, and questions. But before we go on to questions, with my 4 minutes that I've got left, what tends to happen in trusts, whether it's local or offshore, is that families get more and more complicated. And as Matt mentioned, we're now in the 4th generation of beneficiaries within trusts, and we realize how complicated it does get. And we very often split the trust into what we would call sub-accounts, so that each family has their own pot from which their distributions are taken. It's a very, very tax-effective way of managing trusts. The other thing to bear in mind is where the beneficiaries of any trust are resident. If you've got non-resident South African beneficiaries, we need to know. And particularly because US and UK and now French and a whole lot of other jurisdictions, situs applies. And it's very important to understand where they are. It's also very important to know where the investments are, because again, UK, US, French situs, I'm naming those ones in particular because they're topical at the moment, applies, and the trust can be subject to extra tax that you're not expecting. And we can go into that in some detail at a later stage. And what we would do, our modus operandi, is to meet with you, meet with your clients, go through everything, work out what is best, and then give you a recommendation because it is so case specific. I'm just looking at my notes here. You've got to be aware of tax effects for non-residents. One of the tricks, or one of the things you can do, you have this loan to the offshore trust as a South African tax resident. The thing to do is, in your will, is to bequeath the loan to the offshore trust. And in doing so, you very often break the link between South Africa and the offshore trust, which we consider to be an advantage. Just a tip, we deal a lot with the Reserve Bank. We deal with SARS, obviously, all the time. There are rules that apply if you are inheriting offshore with the Reserve Bank. It's important to understand that. If one of your clients inherits property in another jurisdiction, they've got to report it to the Reserve Bank. It's actually within 30 days. So we come across all these sort of issues that people don't even know about, which often leads to them having to do voluntary disclosure programs, etc., etc. So it uncovers all sorts of things that make the clients' lives much more comfortable, because at least they know somebody is looking after them and is taking care of all these issues they actually have no idea about. Last thing is, just be careful that place of effective management of the offshore trust is always offshore. And I've actually come to the end. I don't think there's anything more I'd like to say. It's very high level. It is very complicated. I'd like to thank you all very much for listening. Hope it hasn't been too overwhelming. I always think it's a huge amount of information when I talk so much. But thank you very much, and anything we can do to help, we are there to be of assistance.
Thanks very much. There's a couple of questions that have been asked that I think you could, if you don't mind covering. The first is for the loan from the South African taxpayer, so the loan of assets to a trust. What's the South African Reserve Bank effect and reporting requirements on that loan?
Okay, so if you're doing a loan to the offshore trust and you're using your exchange control allowance, it's your normal exchange control application via SARS. On the exchange control application, you can put that the funds are going to a trust. And there is no Reserve Bank. You don't have to do special reporting to the Reserve Bank over and above that. If for any reason you decide you want to transfer more than your foreign investment allowance every year, so if for some reason you decide in your own name you want to send 20 million, the Reserve Bank is going to block that. They're not going to let you put it into an offshore.
Now you've gone a bit quiet.
Oh, they're not. Can you hear me now?
A little better.
Okay, I'm just going closer to my speaker. Is that better?
Yeah, a bit better.
Okay. So your 10 million Rand foreign investment allowance is the way to go to transfer assets into the trust. Whether it's a loan or donation is up to you to decide, but usually it's a loan. You can also put your 1 million Rand over and above your foreign investment allowance that you've got ex-con approval for in there as well. We've done that often. And there's no extra Reserve Bank reporting. The Reserve Bank may come back at some stage and say you've got this loan to the trust. I think you've got to always be aware with these things that the Reserve Bank and SARS are monitoring it. But all the funds that we've transferred into offshore trust via the exchange control allowance have not been queried. You can request for more money to be sent offshore in 1 year than your 10 million Rand and 1 million Rand allowances, but the Reserve Bank does not allow those funds to go into an offshore trust. So you really...
Thanks, Di.
Okay, thank you.
Another question, can you, we'll touch on the Portugal property question in a sec, Mandy. Let's just go to Trevor's question. Please confirm the limit to transfer funds out of South Africa per year. I think that you've just done that already. Yeah. So 10 million Rand per taxpayer plus single discretionary allowance of 1 million Rand. But we've worked with clients who have done applications of 150 million Rand and more in a single go, and we've had some success. The Portugal property, Di, you can fill in the gaps that I don't. I guess it's something that I know reasonably well because my family are inheriting property in Portugal, as Di knows, and the foreign executor process has taken so far 8 years, and I don't think that they're any closer to resolving it than they were, 8 years ago. So the biggest thing really is just the complexity for a foreign estate to be wound up when there's not a foreign will, when the foreign executor isn't working succinctly with kind of the family and the domestic executor. And so creating some sort of a structure where the assets are transferred into, if they are deemed to be intergenerational assets, will be to the massive benefit of your clients' children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, would be my thoughts on that. Di, what have I missed out there?
Okay, so what we're looking at the moment, because we've got quite a few clients who have now got property in Portugal, is you really need, while it's in their own names, you really need an offshore will in place. And these offshore wills are very specific to the jurisdiction that they relate to. So if you've got a property, or your clients have got a property in Portugal, it needs to be a Portuguese will. And that comes with its own set of complications, so much so that we've now got a contact in Portugal who actually draws up the wills for us, bearing in mind that Portuguese estate law is different to South African law. So you've got to be quite specific as to which jurisdiction is applying. And we now refer all Portuguese property owners to the contact that we've got in Portugal. Kate, is there anything else we need to say about that? But it's actually, they have to do it. Portugal is subject to what's called forced heirship. So they think their South African will, everything's just going to be wound up according to what they want, how they want their heirs to benefit. It's not necessarily going to happen in another jurisdiction. So one needs to understand the jurisdiction of where these assets are all residing, Portugal being one. So Matt, that's our latest. We just refer our clients to actually get a Portuguese will drawn up. The other thing with these offshore wills, you've also got to understand where they've got to be signed and by whom. And very often it has to be certified by a notary public who is registered within the relevant jurisdiction. So often one has to go now to a consulate here to have these things done. So it's not one size fits all again. Okay, thanks, Matt.
So, just last, is there a double tax agreement with Portugal?
You know what, I'll have to find out. I know enough to know when I don't know enough, and I will check.
Okay, guys, great. Well, thanks very much for attending. If there's anything else or any other questions, obviously you can pop them through. Whilst I've got you guys on the line, Andy and I are traveling down to Cape Town next week and to Natal the week thereafter. So if you'd like us to get together in person, or you're taking in-person meetings, please just get in touch with us. But we'll be trying to get together with as many of you as are willing to meet with us. And that's about all. That wraps up our presentation. So guys, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We've kept it to 45 minutes as promised. I hope that you enjoyed it, and obviously if you have a question on the detail, Di would be delighted to help. I know many of you on the call have actually had meetings with Di and clients already, and I think that you'll agree that the way that she deals with clients, the professionalism of the team is second to none. So thanks for joining, and I look forward to chatting to you guys all again soon.